Hello, I'm Julie Swenson, Managing Director of Forward Theater Company in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mike Fisher, a Milwaukee-based theater writer and dramaturg.
I'm Jen Ophoff-Gray, founder and artistic director of Forward Theater Company, and this is Theater Forward, a monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison to Manhattan, we're excited to share insights into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 111 of Theater Forward.
Good to be here.
This month, we are going to be reflecting on the state of our field, especially in the context of last month's Theater Communications Group Biennial Conference in Chicago. Forward Theater is a member of Theater Communications Group, and we're longtime supporters of the organization. Mike attended this year's conference in person. I attended some sessions virtually, and Julie ultimately decided not to attend. And we wanted to talk through the ways in which we value and appreciate this organization's work, and the ways in which we're frankly craving some different kinds of support, as they've seemed to move their primary focus away from the practical needs of nonprofit theaters and towards a more, perhaps, poetic exploration of what theater can be. Hopefully, this glimpse into the conversations we're having about this here at Forward will be interesting food for thought for those listening. So for those who may not know much about TCG, let's just start with a little bit of information. Their mission is to lead for a just and thriving theater ecology. So Theater Communications Group, or as we will henceforth refer to them, TCG, it's the national organization for theater. Since its founding in 1961, its constituency has grown from a handful of groundbreaking theaters to over 750 member theaters and affiliate organizations, and over 3,000 individual members. TCG offers networking and knowledge building opportunities through research, communication, and events, including the annual TCG National Conference, which is one of the largest nationwide gatherings of theater people. TCG advocates for the industry, and they are the publishers of American Theater magazine, which I suspect many of our listeners are familiar with. So that's a little bit of context as we talk about their most recent biennial nationwide conference, which was in Chicago last month. And Mike, you went in person. So what made you decide to go? What were you expecting would come from this?
I mean, partly for me, as somebody that sees a couple of hundred plays a year in Chicago and is very integrated into the Chicago theater scene through my work as a Joseph Jefferson judge, the idea of having the organization in American theater gathered in the place that I think, as I've said many times on this podcast, is the greatest theater city in America was super exciting. And while I didn't think it worked out logistically, we can get to that later, I loved on paper the idea that we were going to be profiling in this conference 3 distinct different regions in which Chicago makes theater, including, most important to me, that we were going to try and bring people to the South Side, which even within Chicago often gets neglected as a place where great theater is getting made and which has a storied history. So I was just sort of proud of the idea, since I'm there anyway, to be able to see how others who were going to be there reacted to the idea of Chicagoland, USA.
And Julie, you decided not to go.
I will say that we were planning for quite a long time, maybe a year out in our budget for the entire staff to go down. The entire staff of Forward Theater was going to go down to Chicago. As our marketing director, Scott, derisively said, to all share a bathroom. We weren't going to do, Scott. And I also, Mike, thought, I was a little concerned about the different places, that it was not in one big hotel room, because I really do like meeting people in the hallway is one of the very best benefits of these kind of conferences. But then looking at what the breakout sessions were, the keynote speakers, the workshops, they were not speaking to us, Forward Theater, as theater makers. And I didn't think there was enough valuable information to be imparted for us to spend as much money as we were planning on spending.
Yeah, and I supported that decision. We were real keen. We were real keen to go. and have a chance to interact in person with colleagues from around the country, and especially because I feel like I've been getting to know so many more colleagues from around the country during these COVID years because of Zoom calls and other opportunities to virtually talk to other people in the field, and building those relationships. I was excited to actually be in three dimensions with some of these folks. But yeah, once it became clear, I get your point, Mike, about how exciting it can be to sort of show off these different parts of Chicago. But like you, Julie, I knew that what it was going to do was actually diminish significantly the opportunities for those sort of opportunistic running into people in the hallways outside the conference, making those connections. And I didn't want to go to Chicago to spend all my time on, in transit, different places. But really, for me, I think the biggest concern I had, because we've talked many times about World Premiere Wisconsin on this podcast, and one of the things we hoped in creating World Premiere Wisconsin was to offer up the structure and what we learned to anyone else who might be interested in adapting this model for other regions, much as we were inspired by the DC Women's Voices Theater Festival. So we had proposed to TCG doing a session on World Premiere Wisconsin at the conference, especially because we were all so close by. The whole leadership team could come down. And in discussions with TCG about whether or not they wanted to put this on the agenda, it became clear in my conversations with their staff that they really were wanting to put the big focus of the conference on, let's talk about big ideas about equity of our field, sustainability of work in the theater, all great things, all great topics for plenary conversations, et cetera, but that they were not planning on including very many sessions where we would share with each other nuts and bolts as producers, as people who work for theater companies, nuts and bolts ideas of ways that we could, do our jobs better. And the word better can apply to all kinds of things, more equitably, more efficiently, more environmentally friendly, cheaper, what have you, and how to make our lives while working in the theater better, our lives, our employees' lives, our audience's lives. Those are the kinds of things I always want to get out of conversations with my peers. What's something you're doing we should try? What's something you did that was a crash and burn, and that now that I know that, I can save us some pain on our end? Those are the things that I look to get out of conferences in whatever field I'm engaged with. And it became very clear that there was going to be very little focus on those kinds of conversations in the official planning of the session agenda. And with the spread out nature of the conference, the opportunity to have those conversations ad hoc looked like it was going to be diminished. So I, like you, Julie, said, I'm not going in person. I think the time and money is going to be spent better elsewhere. But I did they did wind up asking us to do a virtual only presentation on World Premiere Wisconsin. Mike, you were with me for that, as well as several other folks from our leadership team. And it was great to do that. And by doing that, I got a virtual registration and was able to tune in for a few of the sessions that were streamed virtually. I was dismayed. There were only a few slots for virtual programming, and they were all kind of on top of each other. So there were very few that I could log into live. But, I did what I could. Mike, tell us a little bit about your experience actually being there.
Well, first of all, I'm sort of listening to the concerns that you and Julie have expressed about the way in which just geographically the conference was structured in relation to what I said at the top of this podcast. And of course, as is often the case, the two of you were right. And this is actually so logistically, this conference was a nightmare. People were not giving very good directions about how to get to places. They were saying that, a walk from A to B was just, like a few minutes when it was actually over a mile. And you had, as a result, particularly, and this broke my heart with the day on the South Side, very poor attendance, particularly in the first sessions of the day, because it's hard to get from downtown to Hyde Park. And unless there's really good organization around that, it's not going to happen for people. And you didn't have the kind of meeting people in the hallways sort of thing. Because as Jen, you pointed out, sort of theoretically, what you would have been doing, people were spending all of their time getting from A to B, and often in ways that didn't allow you to move from one session to a session starting in the next period, because there just wasn't enough time to get from, say, Wicker Park on the near west side down to, the Goodman, or to, God forbid, the Navy Pier for Chicago Shakes. That's a load to get from one of those places to another on a workday. I'm thinking of Friday in particular. So that was a problem, and it's a microcosm of a bigger problem, which I also kind of alluded to in what I started with, which is what looks good on paper and what theoretically sounds good in terms of things we should be focusing on isn't necessarily a reflection of the sorts of nuts and bolts issues we need to be dealing with. And I'll give you a concrete example. The first plenary on the first day at Chicago Shakespeare was about rising from the ashes. Great topic, important conversation, something which on paper seemed as though it was going to be acknowledging the struggles, the existential crisis, really, that theater in America is facing sort of moving forward. What it was for the first hour and 15 minutes was some songs and asking us in various ways for more money, before we finally got to the speakers, most of whom, even though they were sincere and impassioned, and I agreed with 95% of what they were saying, as I wrote down in my notes from the day, slogan, 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 adjective, 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 performance, 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 sound and fury signifying nothing. All good stuff, but it was people speaking to themselves and each other in an insider way, with lots of things that were great poetry, but no prose. Good sound bites, but no sense of what do we do? And let us talk honestly about where we are in terms of going forward. And I can get later to some of the better. There were some good sessions, including, of course, our own, stacked against like 5 other virtual things and a major in-person event. So that the organization of that meant we had 17 people at our virtual session, which was a shame, given that we had real things to offer. But overall, I thought the poetry was getting in the way of the prose. And what we need with theater always is both. We're both a business, and we're also people who want to make beautiful things that inspire people. And I felt instead it was one or the other, and too much emphasis on the poetry, too much emphasis on making ourselves feel good by preaching to ourselves as a choir, than really thinking through where we needed to go and what we needed to do. So I was very disappointed, honestly, in the conference, despite the best intentions and the fact that there were some great people there saying things that need to be said.
Well, it's interesting. TCG, they have some work to do, it sounds like, because there are things. We are members because, and feel free to disagree with me on this, Jen, but for me, the 2 biggest things are they do the fiscal survey, which is all of the membership companies fill out a form of what they are paying their managing directors, their marketing directors, development. And we then can look at our budget group and figure out, are we in line with those? They also do theater facts, TCG theater facts, very nuts and bolts about the theater industry. Ticket prices, subscriptions, what we're paying for scenic materials, all the things that are of real value to us, which then is so interesting that they would have a conference that covers none of that. There were no nut and bolt workshops and sessions. And I just wonder where they're going, and wonder if, while they keep asking for our money, and it is not a cheap membership, I'm not sure that we are the priority anymore for TCG. The theater company is trying to make it, and I don't know the value of being a member.
Yeah, it's I don't disagree with you about the importance of those 2 things, the value of those 2 things. And I have appreciated it looking the mission statement, the description of TCG that I read at the beginning of this conversation. And it talks about, we've got these 750 member organizations and we've got these 3,000 individual members. And I feel like I'm sensing a a divide that's been widening, not just since COVID, but since the mid 20 teens between who are we serving? Can we serve both of these groups? Can we serve the people who produce theater, nonprofit theater producers, and can we serve freelance theater artists who are most of those individual members? And the answer should be yes, because we aren't enemies. Producers and artists are not enemies. We work together to do this thing. But, hearkening back to some of the, conversations we've had about the union, sometimes there are folks who really want this to be a one or the other, and it can never be. There is no theater field without both. Those theater facts, the fiscal surveys, some of the advocacy work that TCG has, Lori Baskin, who's been their advocacy person for decades, and is incredible, and who also retired last month after, I think, 30 some years at TCG.
Yeah, that's a loss.
She was an exceptional voice on behalf of the theater industry in advocating on Capitol Hill. So those are all things for the greater good that I've been very proud to see some forward dollars going to support. But it's true that when they plan this conference, and frankly, the last several conference agendas, when I see the national, they'll have occasional like virtual conversations or seminars you can plug into. They seem very focused on the theoretical and serving those 3,000 individual members who want to reinvent the field. Fine, nothing wrong with that. And there's a lot to be desired in a reinvention. But I'm craving a conference for people who are like actually working for nonprofit theater companies who want to do our jobs better, and want to be in community with people who will help us do that. And where can I get that?
Well, and the community thing is really important because, look, I think we all, from anybody that's listened to this podcast for more than 6 nanoseconds, knows all of us are passionately committed, as has Forward been since its inception, to expanding our sense of what the theater community entails, to embracing groups and constituencies that have historically been marginalized in ways that TCG, as front and center for TCG, and more power to them that they are focusing some of their energies on that. But they seem to be setting this up, and Jen, you alluded to it, as a binary, that it's either that or talking about actually helping theaters build, that it's either thinking about identity politics or thinking about audience, that it's either thinking about the coasts or thinking about middle America. And when they set up the binaries themselves, and I heard that language of binaries all weekend in a way that sounded sort of like a siege mentality, that it's us versus the world, and we need to make sure that we double down on defending the things that the world is attacking. Understandable in a world where politically there are attacks all over the place against the things that many of us hold near and dear. But you can't lose sight of your audience, and it needs to be a yes and conversation. A big tent means you include all those traditionally important things about building a theater and figure out a way to incorporate within that mission a sense of mission that is expansive. And so in trying to make their tent bigger in all ways we all support, I think TCG has paradoxically put itself in a position where its tent is shrinking, where it's increasingly just speaking to itself, where the choir is just speaking to each other, and where what you're getting is an echo chamber instead of a real sense of what's actually happening on the ground as theaters struggle with making this a yes and conversation instead of an either or conversation.
I was reading
so beautifully said.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes.
Mike, just
so
beautiful.
True. And I was reading a few days ago a bunch of folks who are part of the TCG organization leadership in New York. They published a series of 3 different reflection articles of folks who were at the conference reflecting on what they heard and what they learned. And there were some great things and some great observations in there, but other things that just kind of jumped out at me. And one of the articles was talking about the opening plenary, I believe, that was based on a study that had been done the year after COVID began and emerging from the cave and talking about how do we rebuild. And so in this reflection, the author was saying, 3 years later, these findings still felt relevant as we faced challenges around labor and pay equity, sustaining new work development, and creating innovative models of leadership and institutional infrastructure, period. To which, just side note, I immediately thought to myself, okay, guess those are three really big challenges: labor and pay equity, sustaining new work development, and creating innovative models of leadership and infrastructure. Are we not going to mention the fact that the industry took this seismic hit in audience and revenue, and that like I would put the financial precarity of so many organizations and the fact that so many have closed alongside those other things as the current major challenges facing our field, and it was absent in that reflection. And then the essay goes on to say, the question remains at large: what's the responsibility that theater institutions and theater makers have to the people? And again, how are we holding each other accountable in a time that demands these things from us and our respective institutions? Which again, I support, but the context of that, the responsibility that we have to the people solely refers to the people who work in the theater. Audience has been left entirely out of that equation of who we have a responsibility to as people who make theater. And TCG should be a big tent with a big umbrella in which there are theater makers in this country who are going to make theater purely for the self-expression of creating art. Every individual human should be able to create art solely for the joy of self-expression. But as the national organization supporting the theater industry and the 750 organizations that employ theater artists all over the country, we exist to serve an audience too. And to leave those people out of this conversation of what are our obligations really leaves me feeling hollow inside.
Yeah, it's ironic that one of the best sessions I attended at the conference was called the Global Theater Initiative session, which had nothing to do, and this is what's ironic about it, with making theater in America. Well, only indirectly did it have to do with making theater in America. And yet the concrete examples that were being given by the various representatives who were speaking at this, talking about the theater they were making all over the world, was about as close as we got all weekend to actually talking about what it's like to put on a show and what it looks like. And what sticks with me toward the end of that session, an audience member attending that, his first name is Tyler. I'm sorry, I don't know his last name, but he was there on behalf of, with its founder, David Serta, Helena Handbag Productions, which is a wonderful company in Chicago, very LGBTQ plus forward. I mean, that is their mission, but their mission is through avowedly campy material to let people have fun. And he spoke and he said, in response to one of the presenters, we're losing what it means to have entertainment in theater. Entertainment has become a naughty or bad word. And there were a lot of people who used the word joy all weekend, but it was like they were checking a box that we need theater that's joyful. But there was no real discussion of that. It was so focused on overtly and, to my mind, narrowly political. And politics are important, but political in a way that didn't have this expansive sense of embracing everything, that we weren't thinking about entertainment. And again, Jen, to your point in terms of audience, entertainment's important. And making sure that people are having fun in the context of also doing all these other things and trying to pick plays that are both meaningful and substantive and sort of push the boundaries outward, while also reminding us that at the heart of what it means to be a human being is to love and have fun and show joy with each other, was missing. It felt just, I don't know, sort of sad and just narrow. And like people were so concerned about making sure they were saying the right thing that they weren't talking about saying the joyful, truly joyful thing.
As we wrestle, I think Julie was, as you were saying earlier, it's like you have to pay dues to be parts of national organizations in your field. These are things that come with costs, both in time and cash. And we have really held on. We've seen quite a few peers leave TCG as paying members, including the flagship theater in Wisconsin many years ago, stopped being a dues paying member for, I think, a lot of the reasons we've touched on today. We have been holding out both because we like those practical resources. I have expressed before how much I chair through TCG a biweekly Zoom call with artistic leaders of theaters with budgets in the 1 to 5 million annual size, which is where Forward falls. And those have been invaluable for me to get to talk to people from around the country. And I don't know if it's because I'm chairing them and I'm setting the tone or what, but we just talk about what's on your mind, what's hard about your job right now, what's something you're trying to find out that one of us may have encountered and can share. How are you doing your season planning? Are you still planning a deficit budget? Are you having issues with the unions? How are you doing finding tech staff? Like these kinds of conversations. And it is a joy to have that resource. And so that also has kept us as members, as dues paying members, because I think Forward has benefited from what I get out of those conversations. At the same time, we need to put advocacy dollars and dues dollars towards an organization that's actually looking to represent theater organizations, nonprofit theater organizations around the country. And during this past year, there's a relatively new group, the Professional Nonprofit Theater Coalition, started during the pandemic, led by some really, big dog nonprofit theaters around the country, specifically to advocate at the national level for better arts funding during the pandemic. And they have been really kind of beautifully, impressively expanding their mission to be advocacy, not just COVID specific, but long-term trying to improve arts funding at the federal level in this country. And most of the heavy hitters that you would think of as leaders of nonprofit regional theaters are part of this group. We were invited to join. I've, been able to attend a few of their Zoom calls. They're very smart and pragmatic, just as idealistic about the field and the work we do and the importance of it, but they are very specifically targeting the resources that they have towards strategic advocacy to increase arts funding, and just that narrow task. So we have started paying dues to that organization to invest in the work that they're doing, which we are hopeful down the road will pay dividends to all of us. But there comes a time when we can't keep paying dues everywhere, and may have to make some decisions about where we put our limited resources.
Well, and look, maybe ultimately I would like to think organizations like that, or even if we withdraw from TCG because we're husbanding our resources for an organization like that, hopefully will lead to good things for TCG, because all of us wish the best for TCG. And I think about something like the CIO, which started in opposition to the AFL because it thought the AFL was no longer being truly representative of what labor needed and what average people needed in terms of trying to unionize. It ended up being a very powerful organization when those two organizations came together. But it required, for a time, pushing from the outside, because there was the sense that moving from within the organization, within the AFL, in this case within TCG, was not producing the sorts of results which would lead to genuine change. And I don't want this to be taken for even a second as saying that people in TCG don't listen. That's not what I mean at all. But I think that the nature of organizations, sometimes they just get too big or too set in their ways, or in this case, maybe too captive to a particular constituency, the theater makers, that it's very hard for them, despite what their intentions are, to truly represent everybody or to be able to hear everybody, despite whatever their intent may be in their hearts.
I think TCG has gone down this path for a while. That is not wrong. I'm hoping that they are speaking to people for whom this is really valuable. I think the biggest thing to me right now is that TCG is not speaking to me as a theater maker. And I am hopeful, just as you said, Mike. Do they come back? Does the tent become bigger? They are They are really leaning into their mission of leading for a just, and I want them to continue and lean again into their mission of what thriving theater ecology. And I need to hear more about how we can have a thriving theater ecology.
Yeah. That's really well put, Julie. And Mike, I loved the AFL-CIO analogy. That feels very expansive and hopeful to me. And yeah, I just as we kind of start to wrap this conversation up, I too support what you were saying, Mike. The folks at TCG are, by and large, almost every single one I've interacted with have been extraordinary humans who are working, for deep belief in this field and how it can be better, and with under resourced and uphill battles and all of that. And the folks who I've collaborated with to do these biweekly Zoom calls have been wonderful. And again, Lori Baskin, who just retired, has been a beacon in the field. So this is hopefully this conversation will be seen as the gentle criticism of an organization we have deep love and investment in. But with all that said, if anybody listening wants to put together a practical, pragmatic, nuts and bolts kind of a conference for theater producers in America,
We'll go.
sign me up. Sign me up.
And share a bathroom.
That's right. We'll share a bathroom. And on that note, I am going to say that is all for this episode of Theater Forward, a conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jen Uphoff-Gray.
I'm Julie Swenson.
And I'm Mike Fisher. Our podcast is produced by Scott Hayden, and you can follow us or share your thoughts on Facebook. As always, that's at Theater Forward with an ER for theater. We are an organization that thinks about the bigger population and the United States of America.
And if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us and leave a comment. We would love to hear from you.
We are so grateful to have you listening, and we will be back soon for another Theater Forward conversation.